So are the rules for the super heavy detachments working as intended in Warhammer 40k? And if not, how might they be fixed? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the rules for super heavies in 9th edition and how it might be slightly problematic detachment rules stop them from seeing anywhere near as many games as in 8th. Super heavies in 40k are still a little bit controversial. Quite a lot of people just want them to be balanced against everything else, whereas some people really don't like their aesthetic in regular games of 40k and would rather have them limited to things like Apocalypse. For me, I'm absolutely fine with them in standard games provided they're well balanced, but to be honest, as we don't tend to see very many strong ones in lists at the moment, I don't really think that they are right now. Aside from any one unit's points cost, the detachment rules just really seem to hold them back. At the moment, if you want to field super heavies, you either are spending 3 command points for 1 Lord of War in a super heavy auxiliary detachment, where 3 CP really is quite a lot for any one model, even if it's a big one, and on top of that you don't get any household traditions or chapter tactics or anything like that for the model. They'll very much be slightly weaker versions of themselves than if you take the full super heavy detachment. That one would cost you 6 command points, it gets you 3 to 5 Lords of War, though it does have the bonus that if they're all non-Titanic units, the detachment only costs 3 CP rather than 6. As far as I know, that would only apply to Imperial Knight armigers, so it's a little bit cheaper to include them than their Titanic counterparts. The only way to avoid paying CP for these super heavies is if you play Chaos Knights or Imperial Knights. If the Warlord is from that same detachment, then you get the CP refunded for that super heavy detachment, so they're really the only ones that can avoid the massive CP tax of taking Lords of War. Now I think that those rules are really quite restrictive, and it's very well reflected in the way that we rarely see super heavies on the table in any sort of top lists right now, where I think that the aim for most units in 40k is that they're all usable in a competitive sense, though don't become absolutely dominant and spammed everywhere. I'm sure no one wants to go back to the days of having a Knight Castellan in every second tournament list. In general though, tournament winning armies just really don't seem to include them very much. Knights are generally considered one of the weaker armies in the game right now. I only really tend to see Lords of Skulls popping up every so often in Chaos lists, as they can do some pretty nice combinations with their psychic powers and stratagems. On top of paying the big command point tax, and many super heavies not really being all that efficient for their points, the 9th edition missions just really aren't kind to them either. They're not particularly good at holding down objectives, and you give your opponent quite an easy pick in the Titan Hunters secondary if you do take more than one of them. I do think that the biggest issue though is this command point tax. If you're taking one super heavy, then you're paying 3 command points over the odds for it, compared with just taking other units out of your standard army. It means that super heavies actually really need to be quite undercosted to even think about taking them. If you could do the job equally well with units out of the core codex, then why would you pay 3 CP to take something else that could do something just the same? I think it is a bit of a sad situation, as it does keep quite a lot of iconic units on the shelf. The new Necron monolith being made a Lord of War choice was a really bad thing for it. I'm sure it would have seen far more play if it had been a heavy support rather than that. The Guard Baneblade chassis equivalents really aren't in a good place in comparison with some of the other options, that are even further hindered by the CP tax and sometimes lack of a regimental trait if they're only in a super heavy auxiliary. And it certainly doesn't help things like Orc Stompers, Tau Storm Surges, Eldar Wraith Knights, or any of the other Space Marine and Guard super heavies. A lot of these just aren't desperately point sufficient in the first place, particularly the Stomper, but being slapped with a multiple command point tax on top of that is just not great. I also really quite dislike the way that the detachment rules mean that you're either thinking about taking 1 or 3 of them. I think ideally quite a lot of players would just like to take 1, maybe as a linchpin model or centerpiece, but then you're paying a full 3 CP for that one choice, so it's extra inefficient, and you don't get chapter traits or household traditions. It means that just bringing 1 really isn't all that efficient. If you bring 2, then that's just as bad as bringing 1. You'd have to take 2 super heavy auxiliary detachments. So if you want to run Lords of War anywhere near efficiently, you need to spam out 3 of them. That way you're paying less command points per Lord of War, you get the household or chapter traits, but it does kind of force you to play a weird skew list. Usually they're quite points intensive, so you're not going to have all that many points for other things. In particular, I just don't really see why there's much point in punishing players for taking 2 super heavies. It doesn't really seem far less fluffy than taking 1 or 3 to me. So what kind of options could Games Workshop do if they did want to tweak the rules a bit to make it a bit more of an incentive to take something like a Baneblade or a Monolith as a centerpiece to your army? To be honest, I think that if they didn't change anything and there's still such a big command point tax, they'd really have to quite drastically drop the points on all the super heavies, make them really efficient for what they do, as of course you're going to have less options in game with a far fewer command points. I don't really think that this is the best solution though. I think it would encourage more people to spam lots of them or none at all. And it's certainly not a great feeling in game if you're playing against something that's absolutely enormous. There's not really all that much counter strategy to it, and it's just plainly more efficient than your models. Otherwise, they might think about changing the super heavy detachment somehow. Maybe they could fuse the super heavy and the super heavy auxiliary, possibly pay 2 CP for one Lord of War, and then 4 CP for 2 or more in the same detachment. Still a reasonable tax, but nowhere near as much as it is right now. Or they could think about giving super heavies a bit of a bonus if it's the same faction as the Warlord. Maybe super heavy or super heavy auxiliaries cost fewer CP if they're the same faction as your army's Warlord. Or maybe allow them to get their chapter trait or regimental trait in a super heavy auxiliary, again if they're the same faction as the Warlord is. For me, that would make a lot of sense, and it would seem pretty reasonable to me. Say if you're running an Eldar Wraith Knight from the same craft world as your main detachment, it just doesn't really make much sense that it would lose its craft world attribute, despite just technically being a super heavy auxiliary. Perhaps one other alternative to encouraging just 1 or 2 Lords of War to be played in an army might be to add a Lord of War slot to battalions or brigades. That way you do need some significant commitment to the army in question. If it's allied, then you're still spending command points, but it makes them far easier to include one if you are just running the one Lord of War from the same army. For me personally, I think I'd prefer them just to change the super heavy detachment. Either costing a bit less or having a bit more synergy with the faction's Warlord would be very nice. So let me know what you think for the rules for super heavies in 9th. Do they need a tweak, or are they fine and working as intended, keeping super heavies into more niche roles, maybe appearing more in casual and narrative games as opposed to more competitive army lists? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do try and put out some new 40k content every single day. Finally, if you have been enjoying my videos, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which is what allows me to make content quite so frequently for the channel. If you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's regular prize draws with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If you'd like to check any of that out, feel free to have a look at the link in the video description, and a massive thank you to all you guys and girls who are supporting this channel. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.